What's good, y'all? Riley Beats here, and today we're going to talk about sound selection for your drums. This video idea comes directly from Vale, the man, the myth, the legend himself. So big shout out to Vale for that. Really appreciate you. When you said this idea, I loved the idea. I recorded the video the same day. You know, Vale knows that I recorded the video the same day because Vale, he edits the videos. You know, I send them to him once they're recorded. But anyways, let's get right into it. If you could leave a like, comment, and a subscribe, I would greatly appreciate that. You would greatly appreciate that. The community would greatly appreciate that. And you know what? It might even make it so that we only ever meet nice, friendly, non-aggressive aliens. You never know, but there's only one way to find out. So like I said, let's get right into it. So pretty much my idea for this video, or well, Vale's idea, but the way I interpreted it is more so I'm not going to be telling you what drums to pick because every beat's different. I don't think I have any right to tell you what drum to pick. I do have some things that I would like to tell you to keep in mind when picking your drums. Mainly just what you're kind of looking for. And I'm going to pull up some drums just for some good examples. So first, we're gonna start with 808s. Alright, so I got two 808s here. And the first thing that we want to cover with 808s is there's two main things really to keep in mind when you're sound selecting, and that's pretty much the thump and the punch of the 808. So I have a really non-punchy 808 here and a really punchy 808. I'll play both side to side. So here's the non-punchy 808. Not really much punch. You can hear it. It's more of like a bass. There isn't really much of a kick sound to it or really any punch at all. And here's the extremely punchy 808 that I found. You can even see the punch, you know? So keeping the punch in mind, the punch mainly takes up the middle, like the higher frequencies of the 808. The same thing kind of applies to kicks. You can have punchy kicks, you can have thumpy kicks. Those are the main two things though. With kicks and 808s, you have punch and thump. Those are your main two things that you want to notice in your kick. When you're picking a sound, this is important because sometimes you want a thumpy kick, sometimes you want a punchy kick. And I'm gonna really like accentuate the punch here. I'll even take out the thump so you can really hear just the punch. So the punch is more so what kind of hits. It's more audible. It hits you in the face. It's more heard than felt. Now the thump, on the other hand, it's more so what you feel, and you can feel it a lot with this 808 here. So you can see there's not a lot of punch going on, but there's a lot of thump, which is this bass. This is what will move the speakers. This is what will rock your car. This is more deep. You know, it's felt, less heard. So if you're looking for a thumpier sound, this is something to keep in mind. If you're looking for a punchier sound, this is something to keep in mind too. So like while you're making beats, it's good to keep in mind, maybe you want a punchy kick, maybe you want a punchy 808, maybe you want a thumpy kick, maybe you want a thumpy 808, whatever it is, one way or the other, this is kind of something you can look at just to get a better grasp on that. So another thing to keep in mind too, because again, we have punch, we have thump for the 808. Another thing to keep in mind is the distortion to the 808. Some 808s are distorted, some are not. And this really depends on your preference and what you're going for. So for example, some like Juice WRLD 808s will be very distorted and some will be a little bit more clear. So the distortion, I'm just going to boost it in here, for example. And this kind of boosts those higher frequencies. Oftentimes it can make things a little bit more punchy. And if we go over to this one, you can already see that there is some clipping going on here with the waveform. I'm just going to clip it even more. This does make this 808 sound really bad just because there's already a lot of clipping going on. But sometimes you want your sound to be distorted. Sometimes you don't really want it to be distorted, but it brings things up more into the mid-range. And not really brings things up, but it accentuates the mid-range while also decreasing the lower frequencies a little bit. So with the fuzz that gets added from the clipping, from the distortion you add in there, the lower frequencies become less and the higher frequencies become more. So this can make something really punchy. For example, a kick, like in drill, they'll clip the kicks very, very hard and that'll make the kicks super, super punchy, but it also gets rid of that thump a little bit. And back to the example of drill, the 808s in drill can be extremely, extremely thumpy where the kicks are super punchy. So kicks are a whole different breed, but they're very similar to 808s with the punchiness and the thumpiness. Like I mentioned with the drill example, clipping your kick can make it more punchy. So I will have an example of that right here. So we have a kick, and I'm just gonna mute this, and I'm gonna clip it. Just gonna throw a soft clipper on there, and I'm gonna turn it up in here a bit. So it should already be clipping, but I'm gonna make it clip really hard. So you hear that kick being super punchy. If I were to take that off and just turn it down a bit, it would be a bit more thumpy. And I got a thumpier kick here as an example as well. And you can really hear the difference in that the thumpy kick is more felt, whereas the punchy kick is a lot more punch. You can hear it, it cuts through a bit more. Now, the other thing that is important to keep in mind with kicks, and this is also good to keep in mind in relation to 808s, it's not a rule to live by, you don't need to do this, but typically for slower beats, like if your beat is really slow, you'll typically want a longer 808 because again, it is sort of a bass instrument. And when you have a longer 808, you'll often want a shorter kick. So you can see here, this kick, you can hear it's not too long. This one, you can hear it's a little bit shorter. Now, if your beat is faster, it's very common to have a much shorter 808. Sometimes you won't need a kick, mind you, but when you do have a shorter 808, it can be better to layer it with a longer kick. So the 808 and the kick kind of have that sort of relationship. Now, this is the fun part. We're gonna get into snares. Snares are pretty straightforward though. Like there isn't a whole lot. I'll throw claps and snares in there too. I'll actually pull up a clap real quick. There's I don't even know what the correct term for one of them is, but the two most important things with your snare, your clap, whatever it may be, is you have something in the higher frequency, and that's your sharpness. So if I really boost up here, this clap is going to sound very sharp. Now, on the same note, we have some depth down here in the clap, and I can boost that, and the clap won't sound as sharp, but it'll have a bit more depth to it. And this can be nice depending on what you're going for in your beat, and something to look out for. If you want a more deep snare or a deeper clap, you can look for something that hits more here as opposed to in the higher end. There's a big difference, and this is just the same clap. So we have your sharpness and you have your depth there, and there's the basic clap. And like I said, claps are pretty straightforward. Snares, same kind of thing. Oftentimes, if you do have a deeper snare or a deeper clap, it can give a meaner feeling. And an example of this is like Metro Boomin in his Razor videos that he did. He talked a bit about pitching his snare down just to give it a meaner, darker kind of feel to it, and that is because it'll hit a bit harder in those lower frequencies. So I pulled up a bunch of hi-hats here. There's a little bit more to take into account with hi-hats, but again, it's pretty simple. You do have that sharpness, and you do have that depth that I talked about with snares and claps that applies to hi-hats as well. But something very important is the length, you know? So this hi-hat, if I shortened it more, it would be a little bit more, it would sound a bit more like a tick as opposed to a hi-hat, like that, and then longer it sounds like this. So just that tail is important to keep in mind. Maybe you want a shorter hi-hat, maybe you want a longer hi-hat. Again, with faster beats, it's pretty common to have a shorter hi-hat, and with slower beats, it's also pretty common to have a longer hi-hat. So this would be an example of a longer hi-hat, and this hi-hat has a bit more depth to it. It sounds a bit more like a realistic hi-hat being played as opposed to like an 808 hi-hat. Sounds cool though, in my opinion. So another thing you'll run into quite often, you'll come into these hi-hats that have a little bit of like a phaser on them or some kind of effect, some modulation of some sort. And again, that is something you can add yourself to your own hi-hats. I often add phaser to my hi-hats, just a personal preference thing. But it is something to keep an eye out for and something to keep in mind when you're selecting your sounds. That maybe you want a hi-hat that has some kind of phase effect or something on it. This one kind of has something similar to that, and it is a bit of a longer hi-hat as well. And this hi-hat is a little bit more of like a phased hi-hat, like I mentioned, but it's also long and has a bit more depth to it as opposed to the sharpness. I think open hats are a pretty interesting thing because you can have a wide variety of open hats. You can have some acoustic ones, you can have some short ones, you can have some long ones. Again, the sharpness and depth to these still apply. So I've opened up some hi-hats here. I have a pretty short one. This is more of like a trap open hat. Pretty short. You know, if I shortened it a lot, it could even pull off as a hi-hat. So the length of your open hats is pretty important. Again, the sharpness and depth does apply to your open hats, but the length is very important to keep in mind because maybe you want something that's short, maybe you want something that's long. It really depends on what you're going for, but always keep that in mind pretty much. And if you have a long open hat and you just want to make it shorter, you have many ways you can make it shorter. You can just do this in FL Studio. I'm not too sure about other DAWs. So you'll run into some open hats from time to time that kind of sound weird. They have like a weird effect to them too. Maybe that's what you're looking for. Keep those in mind too, because again, I love using those kinds of open hats. I used one in a beat I made not too long ago. Here's an example of one. Not really much to it, but it's cool. And then you'll get these open hats that have a lot of depth to them, and they can be pretty cool too, but you know, use them how you want to use them at the end of the day, but keep in mind why you're using it. And then this is just my personal open hat, my personal favorite open hat. It's a pretty long one, so oftentimes when I'm using it, I do shorten the open hat pretty significantly, just because it is long, and I don't really need a long open hat a lot of the times. And it's a pretty sharp one as well. I think in general with sound selection for drums, there isn't really a whole lot to dive into, you know, like you have your sharpness, you have your depth, you have your punch, your thump. You don't need to go too crazy with all of that, but those are just some things to keep in mind. And typically like at the faster beats, like I mentioned, you may want shorter or longer things depending on what you're using. And again, depending on the genre you're making or what sound you're going for, you may want something with more punch, something with more thump. Again, it depends what you're doing and what you're going for, but this is kind of just some tools and some tips to kind of find what you're looking for a bit more, so you can kind of put some names to what you're looking for. Like for example, when I'm making a beat, I'll be like, okay, I want like a punchy kick here. I'll find a kick that's punchy, like I'll know what I mean by that. Perks are a cool thing. I like perks. I don't really use them a whole lot because again, I feel like they can take up a lot of space unnecessarily, and that can be a mess at times, but if they're used right, they can be great. They can be amazing. So there's a bunch of perks here. And I think the biggest thing for perk sound selection is intention. If you're trying to add a little bit more bounce, a perk can be a great tool for you. But if you're just trying to throw it in there just because, it can kind of mess things up. So recently there was a beat and I didn't add an accent snare to it, which I usually do. What I planned to do instead was add some perks to have the same kind of effect. So I used this one and I layered it with this perk. And together that kind of created a nice little bounce, a nice little effect, because this perk has a bit of depth to it and this perk has a bit more sharpness to it. So it gave a nice sound in that regard. Again, like a nice thing to keep in mind with perks is effect. So like a chant here, you know, you can layer this in a way so that it's felt, which I did it recently on a beat that I made where it was more felt, and then there was another perk that got layered on it that was more heard. And it can add energy, you know, like when you hear someone just like chanting in the back, it hypes you up a little bit more. So using it as a layer more so than just kind of a percussive instrument can really add some depth to everything. And keeping in with that, maybe you're trying to go for like a little section or something. You could have a break and then all of a sudden you have like a little phone perk go off, you know, or like the Nextel chirp in what's it called, Lucid Dreams by Juice WRLD. That percussion is kind of used in that way. Like a big part of that album, the Goodbye and Good Riddance album, is there's these skits that are kind of like phone calls, like phone voice messages that are left, and so they use that Nextel chirp. It kind of ties that theme of the album together a little bit nicer. At least that's my interpretation of it, and it sounds pretty cool. So again, just like with perks, you want to keep in mind why you're using it, where you're using it, because if there's no space for the perk, don't throw the perk in there. And then you need to keep in mind, does it really fit in with the track? Like for example, if you're making a drill beat and all of a sudden you just start throwing cowbells all over the place, like that cowbell, why? You know, maybe you're doing like a funk drill mashup, that could go hard. But if you're just doing like a traditional, like you got some New York drill and you're just slapping cowbells all over the place because you think it sounds cool, you gotta ask yourself, does it fit? Again, that's pretty much the whole video, just some simple sound selection stuff. And again, thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. That's gonna be all for now. Peace.